Okay.
And يعني
Now, are they clear about what the Islamic alternative is that they want? Is it fair to say that they're all in tune as to the demands of having a khilafah, a caliphate afterwards?
See, this is where the lines become blurred, as I said, because you have 1,000 fighting brigades in Syria, right? Most of them are local brigades, and then you have 8 main brigades, right? A majority of these 8 main brigades have clearly articulated the need for an Islamic state, Dawla Islamiyya. Some have referred to it as Dawlat al-Shura, some have referred to it as a Khilafah, and so forth. So the idea that yes, we must have an Islamic alternative, which is the Islamic state, has been clearly articulated by the main fighting brigades, including Ahrar al-Sham, Jabhat al-Nusrah, Sukur al-Sham, certain members of Liwa al-Tawheed, Liwa al-Islam, and so forth. And of course, I think I said Jabhat al-Nusrah. But the problem, right? And this is where it's necessary to provide a certain political narrative. The problem and the reality of the matter is that this Islamic state, right, or this notion of the Khilafah, right, which is being pushed forth, has not yet been clearly articulated by the fighting brigades. But at the same time, one has to realize that these are fighting brigades. Their function is to repel the Syrian regime, and they're not political movements.
Okay.
So this is where
But there are political movements on the ground.
There are political movements on the ground.
Hizb ut-Tahrir is
Without
there,
doubt.
and it's definitely gained an enormous amount of support and following in the recent year. So, how significant is their role in the revolution?
I can tell you from personal experience, being based in Lebanon and meeting many of our brothers from Hizb ut-Tahrir, including brother Hisham al-Baba, may Allah preserve him, that Hizb ut-Tahrir is deeply rooted in the Syrian revolution, and it is constantly coordinating with key figures, whether it's from the quote-unquote radical Islamic movement in terms of providing them advisory, right, or with some of the quote-unquote more moderate movement in terms of warning them not to fall into neoliberal plots and so forth. But so the role of Hizb ut-Tahrir in Syria is, of course, Hizb ut-Tahrir in and of itself does not fight, does not engage in any military activity. It is a political, intellectual movement. So the role of Hizb ut-Tahrir in Syria has been essentially to orient the revolution, right? Orient the revolution, because the believer is not stung at the same hole twice. So essentially, we don't want certain elites from the outside to try to hijack the revolution, right? As happened in Egypt. This has been the role of Hizb ut-Tahrir, to preserve the Islamicity and the purity of the revolution, right, towards true liberation, which can be established through a khilafah which would invert and liberate the Muslim world from quote-unquote international law, which is essentially law which subordinates us to the West and maintains our dependency. And alhamdulillah, Hizb ut-Tahrir has been successful in doing so.
So the purity of the revolution, as of now, it's obvious that it's pure.
Very much so.
And the proof of that is actually America's strategy towards dealing with Syria. It seems to be all across the board, from war to constantly fumbling around. So, what do you believe is the real strategy, or America's real strategy, if there is one?
America's real strategy is there hasn't been a new strategy. It hasn't developed a new strategy. It's still following a strategy which was strategized by Brzezinski, right, and Ronald Reagan, and then it was carried up by Bill Clinton, and it was put into play by George Bush. And this is the idea that this is what's called the politics of inclusion, which essentially means that we must bring the moderate Islamists, quote unquote. This was, for example, in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, and in Syria, right, people like Jabra, Mu'adh Khatib, and so forth, and Salim Idrisi, the moderate Islamists, bring them into power, and at the same time marginalize the radical Islamists, i.e. marginalize the Islamists that would uproot the political structures and invert our subordination to neoliberal politics and so forth. So it's essentially what they refer to as the politics of inclusion, but in reality it's the politics of exclusion, excluding Islam, right? Again, as I said, through securing alliances with moderate Islam, and that's exactly what's happening today in Syria.
But it's obviously been a disaster for them,
No
and
doubt.
Obviously it's the awareness that's on the ground that's causing them a huge roadblock, I guess, in their agenda. So what do you see in the near future? Can you really put your finger at a direction in which this revolution will continue? Or is it possible that the opposition, the Western-backed opposition, will somehow gain a foothold in Syria?
In terms of what I see happening, right, as of now, and alhamdulillah, we should always be optimistic, as of now, the Islamicity of the revolution is very clear. Because I mean, look at, for example, Barack Obama's recent rhetoric and this very heated discourse about striking Syria, and then suddenly there's a radical change of discourse and a appeal to more moderate discourse of, you know, trying to take Bashar al-Assad's chemical weapons. At the same time, Obama declared support for the moderate Islamist factions in Syria. So on one hand, I believe that there will be a continued push to promote moderate Islamism in Syria, right, and try to push them towards the capital, towards Damascus.
And specifically who?
There's several factions. It's a very loose. Again, when we say the Free Syrian Army, it's a very loose set of brigades. But there's, for example, Katibat al-Faruq, the Faruq brigades. There's Liwa al-Islam and there's Liwa al-Tawheed. Again, these are very big brigades, so I don't want to generalize. I'm talking about the political leadership.
But even, like, I've heard mention of Al-Faruq brigade, and on the ground they seem to be the least trusted of all the brigades on the ground.
Exactly, and I've personally spoken, because at the same time, we have to be clear about some issues. I've personally spoken to refugees who have told me, who have witnessed what the quote-unquote Free Syrian Army, this is using their word, what the Free Syrian Army did to certain towns and cities when they were taken over, right? And then what the Islamists did when they took over those cities. So, for example, you had certain camps in Syria which were taken over by what's called Jaysh al-Hur, very loosely called Jaysh al-Hur. And they came to be known for corruption, unfortunately, right? And of course, I'm not generalizing, I'm speaking about certain individuals. Shortly after Jabhat an-Nusrah took over, things changed 180 degrees. And this is according to eyewitness reports from Syrian refugees, several refugees whom I have spoken to, and who are, by the way, anti-regime, who are very much against Bashar al-Assad. So, to go back to your question, what I see happening in Syria, I see that the US will continue to try to politically and militarily promote the quote-unquote moderate factions in Syria, whether this is in providing them assistance in Jordan and trying to push them towards the capital, to Damascus. And there are reports that this is already underway, one hand. And on another hand, the quote-unquote radical Islamic factions will continue to make gains. So eventually they will come head-to-head. And this is where a key political strategy comes in. A political strategy which can be all-inclusive in that it can take in these Islamic factions and take in the sincere members of these quote-unquote moderate Islamic factions and provide a unifying political alternative for Syria. And I don't see this coming anywhere from within the brigades who are divided in and of themselves, but I see it coming from some sort of external independent group, whether it's a group of scholars, right? And this is being, and this is something which is currently being pushed for by scholars, by certain Islamic figures in Lebanon. And I've personally spoken to them, and by political groups such as Hizb ut-Tahrir, for example, who also has provided the brigade with a unifying political vision, which is referred to as the Mithaq al-Amal, like the manifesto for action in Syria, and elucidated in detail in Nizam al-Hukm fil Islam, Islamic system of governance, and the Islamic their draft of the Islamic constitution and so forth. So
ultimately, this revolution will be won through ideas.
Exactly.
It's not militarily.
Exactly.
There's nothing that they can really do at the end of the day. It's obvious that the whole world is united against the Syrian revolution.
No doubt.
And the ideas, their steadfastness and their determination to implement the ideas that they hold true to is what's going to win this revolution for them. And the media will constantly brush off the opposition by somehow claiming that there's some affiliation to al-Qaeda. What are your thoughts on that?
Again, this is a generalization fallacy, right? This idea that al-Qaeda is the dominant faction in Syria, and again, this is created in order to obscure the revolution. It's a strategy of divide and conquer. It's a strategy of creating dichotomies, binaries, and it's a fallacy. It's a false binary. Al-Qaeda, what's referred to as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, Bilad al-Sham, is again one of the 8 main fighting brigades, and not the only brigade. Right. So they are in no way the dominant faction. And even if one were to look at the actions of al-Qaeda in what's referred to as al-Qaeda in Iraq, one would see that al-Qaeda as a fighting movement, right, as a military movement, has evolved drastically, right, from the Iraq scenario and so forth. So even al-Qaeda in and of itself, right, has changed its discourse and has changed its approach. So, for example, if one looks at the cities which al-Qaeda currently administers, or the ISIS, the Islamic State the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, one would find, for example, that they have dawah camps, right? One would see that they, for example, they provide stipends so that people can buy bread and.
But it's a loose affiliation.
It's a loose affiliation. Exactly. It's an affiliation with this idea of a global Islamic movement, global jihad, liberation, struggle against the false idols, and so forth. It's not necessarily this political allegiance to a particular organization.
So you would pretty much say that their presence is insignificant in the scheme of things? It's
not insignificant, right? But at the same time, they don't have a dominant role. Okay. And even if they were to have a dominant role, if one looks at the activities of al-Qaeda and the ISIS in the liberated areas which they administer, one would find a scene completely different to that which is depicted by the media. And I encourage the listeners to actually look into this. Okay. Right? I mean, footage is available on YouTube, Live Leak, and other outlets as such.
So I guess there's various different angles that we can address this, but what does success in Syria mean for the region? What if this revolution does succeed? What does that mean?
Success for the region is fundamental. It will bring about fundamental change from a geostrategic perspective and from an ideological perspective.
And if you can highlight what is the scenario that America fears the most?
What America fears is, again, radical change in Syria.
Okay.
Radical change in Syria means liberation from the existing power relations and power structures, which are represented by the existing security apparatus, right, which have always been allies of the US, one, and two, international law, to which we have been subordinated. Radical change would mean that power relations are inverted, right? So what essentially you have is an entity which is politically, economically, and ideologically, this is the most important, independent, right, and no longer constrained by the neoliberal elites.
So these factions that are fighting, there may come a time soon in which they are statesmen, not willing to negotiate with the West whatsoever.
If they were going to negotiate, they would have negotiated
long ago.
3 years ago, 2 years ago, 1 year ago. They would have negotiated when the rebels had major losses, right, across Syria. But alhamdulillah, Allah Azza wa Jalla has kept them steadfast. Allah has preserved the purity of this revolution, and inshallah ta'ala, everything indicates it will continue as such. Inshallah ta'ala.
So therefore the fears that Mu'allim has about this revolution spreading to Jordan and Turkey and so on and so forth are a very possible scenario.
I believe that is a very possible scenario, because the Muslim world, as the Arab Spring indicates, is demanding change, and it is demanding Islamic change. So Syria would provide that model, inshallah ta'ala.
And again, the victory is the result of ideas and not the actual fighting force on the ground.
Exactly.
Jazakallah khair, brother. Barakallah feek. And inshallah we will continue these discussions further on.
Inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum.